The leaders of the G7 nations will regather for day 2 of their summit in Hiroshima, Japan. On day 1, the leaders had decided to stiffen sanctions against Russia. They also say they need to reduce reliance on trade with China. An early version of the draft communique, which will be issued after the talks, say the goal was not to harm or even hinder China's economic progress, calling for constructive talks with Beijing. But the draft called for reducing excessive dependencies in critical supply chains. Reacting to this, China's embassy in Japan said it is gravely concerned about recent signs of negative China-related moves at the G7 summit and urges Japan not to turn it into a political show against or to curb China. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was invited by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, arrived in Hiroshima on Friday evening. The leaders held delegation-level talks on the sidelines of the summit. Today, the Indian Prime Minister will also held talks with leaders from Japan, South Korea and Vietnam on the sidelines of the Hiroshima G7 summit. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is set to join the group later today. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are set to hold talks later today as well. This will be the first time the two leaders are meeting in person since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Meanwhile, the G7 leaders also say they ensured Ukraine had the budget support it needs for this year and early 2024. In a statement issued on Friday, the G7 leaders said, "We are taking new steps to ensure that Russia's illegal aggression against the sovereign state of Ukraine fails and to support the Ukrainian people in their quest for a just peace rooted in respect for international laws." To this end, the US, UK and Canada hit Russia with a fresh set of sanctions. The US Treasury Department sanctioned 22 people and 104 entities. It includes a Liechtenstein-based Russian intelligence services procurement network and a Netherlands-based procurement agent. The US State Department sanctioned almost 200 individuals, entities, vessels and aircraft. Sanctions have also been imposed on an international network. It procures components for the manufacturing of the Orlan drone. Russian forces and their proxies are using the Orlan drone in Ukraine. The United Kingdom announced a new wave of sanctions against Russia. These target companies connected to the alleged theft of Ukrainian grain. This includes 86 so-called shady individuals and entities connected to the theft and resale of Ukrainian grain. Britain also published plans to ban imports of Russian diamonds, copper, aluminium and nickel. Canada announced sanctions on 17 individuals and 18 entities linked to Russian companies that provide military technology. Canada also sanctioned 30 individuals and 8 entities involved in Russia's ongoing human rights violations.
The most important thing we can do right now for global peace and security is to support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia, but also to ensure that Russia pays a price for its illegal and unprovoked act of aggression. That's why we've announced new sanctions today. My message to Putin is straightforward, and we're not going away. Russia has conducted an illegal, unprovoked act of aggression by invading Ukraine, and Russia needs to know that we and other countries remain steadfast in our resolve to support Ukraine.
And for more on this, we're now being joined live by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sithan Sibol from Hiroshima, Japan. Sithan Sibol, good to see you. Some of the guest nations that have been invited include Brazil, Indonesia, Comoros Islands, which is leading the African Union, and the Cook Islands, which will be chaired by the Pacific Islands Forum. What more do we know about these 8 countries that have been invited for this Hiroshima summit?
Well, there are 2 aspects to it. First, of course, the G7 led by Japan is keen that G7 remains a part of global structure, global governance structure, and for that it needs some kind of inclusive approach. For that, the Japanese side has invited countries who are partner, allies, friends, whether it's India, Indonesia, Australia. And the second aspect has been that the Japanese side is keen to show that there is an alternative when it comes to supporting countries in the global south barring, of course, Chinese option or perhaps the Russian option. So an alternative is something the Japanese side is seeking. We know the Japanese side has been involved in mega infrastructure projects across Asia. For example, in India, they have been involved in a connectivity project in India's northeast that connects to Bangladesh. They have been building a mega port in Bangladesh, the Matawari port. So that has been the focus of the Japanese foreign policy. So these are the two aspects, but nonetheless, we know that the global geopolitics has changed dramatically in last 2 decades, and because of that, the relevance of G7 is something that has also come under question, because if you look at the combined economic output of the BRICS grouping, for example, versus the G7 grouping, the BRICS grouping now outpaces the G7 in every sense possible, something that was a defining feature of the G7 grouping when it was formed in last century.
Siddhan Sibol, have you managed to talk to some of the delegates who are in this Hiroshima summit? What are they saying about, for instance, the first day of the summit? Was it successful, or more needs to be done?
Well, it's a 3-day summit. Today is the second day. Of course, the Japanese side is keen that it becomes a successful summit, and we know that today there will be focus on the G7 summit itself. That has been the focus since yesterday, but also the outreach meeting where the all invited 8 countries will be participating, raising their worries, especially worries emerging from Russia-Ukraine conflict in terms of food, fuel and commodity price rise, something that has pinched the global south equally. Tomorrow will be another important day when President Zelensky will be present in Hiroshima and attend the G7 summit's proceedings, including meet the 8 invited countries. He already has a bilateral schedule with the Indian Prime Minister today. So essentially, it's a packed agenda here in Hiroshima, and focus, of course, from the Japanese side is that this summit becomes successful, as the Japanese foreign ministry spokesperson earlier told WION in an exclusive conversation.
Live from Hiroshima, Japan, our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhan Sibol. We'll see you later. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.